Women warriors. First Document Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her Apache attack helicopter as dawn broke over the desert landscape. The radio crackled with nervous chatter from ground troops below. She had trained for this moment for 8 years, but the weight of proving herself as one of the first women in combat aviation felt heavier than the aircraft itself. The year was 2003, and the military had only recently opened combat aviation roles to women. Sarah and her fellow female pilots faced skepticism from every corner. Male pilots questioned their physical strength. Commanders worried about their emotional stability under fire. Ground troops openly doubted whether women could handle the intense pressure of combat missions. Sarah remembered her first day at flight school when Instructor Williams pulled her aside. "Listen, Mitchell," he had said, his weathered face serious. "I'm not saying you can't do this, but flying an Apache isn't like driving a car. These machines weigh 17,000 pounds. When bullets start flying, you need split-second reflexes and nerves of steel. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Those words echoed in her mind as she completed her pre-flight checks. The Apache helicopter was indeed a beast of a machine. Its twin engines could push it to speeds of over 180 miles per hour. The 30mm chain gun mounted beneath could fire 625 rounds per minute. Hellfire missiles hung from the weapon pylons like sleeping predators ready to strike. But Sarah knew every bolt, wire, and circuit in this machine. She had spent countless hours in simulators, practicing emergency procedures until they became second nature. Her instructor scores had been among the highest in her class. Still, she felt the burden of representation weighing on her shoulders. Captain Lisa Rodriguez occupied the front seat as the gunner. Like Sarah, she had faced years of doubt and discrimination. During training, male soldiers would openly bet against the women pilots in combat scenarios. Some officers suggested that women lacked the killer instinct needed for attack missions. "You ready for this, Rodriguez?" Sarah asked through the internal communication system. "Born ready," Lisa replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of their first real combat mission. "Let's show them what we can do." The mission briefing had been straightforward. Intelligence reports indicated enemy fighters had established positions in the mountains overlooking a strategic valley. Friendly ground forces needed air support to advance safely. What seemed like a routine mission would soon become a test of everything the women pilots had learned. Colonel Barnes, the mission commander, had been skeptical about assigning female crews to this operation. He had served in the military for 25 years and believed in traditional roles. "I'm not being sexist," he often said, "but combat is different. It's not about equality, it's about effectiveness." The other helicopter crews consisted entirely of male pilots and gunners. They had years of combat experience and had proven themselves in previous conflicts. Sarah and Lisa were the unknown quantities in this equation. As they lifted off from the forward operating base, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the Apache rising into the air. The helicopter responded to her touch like a living creature. She had always felt more comfortable in the cockpit than anywhere else on Earth. The flight to the target area took 45 minutes across rugged terrain. Sarah navigated through mountain passes and valleys, staying low to avoid enemy radar detection. The other helicopters maintained formation around them, their pilots maintaining radio silence to avoid giving away their position. Lisa monitored the weapon systems and scanned the horizon for threats. The target acquisition and designation system provided detailed imagery of the ground below. Everything appeared normal until they approached the target coordinates. "Contact," Lisa reported suddenly. "I'm seeing multiple heat signatures in the rocks below. Estimate 12 to 15 enemy fighters with heavy weapons." Sarah's heart rate increased, but her hands remained steady on the controls. This was it, the moment of truth. She could hear her own breathing through the communication system as adrenaline flooded her system. The lead helicopter, piloted by Major Thompson, began the attack run. Sarah watched as rockets streaked toward enemy positions, sending up clouds of dust and debris. Return fire immediately erupted from multiple locations. Green tracers filled the air as enemy fighters engaged the helicopters with machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. "Apache 2, you're clear for your attack run," came Thompson's voice over the radio. Sarah banked the helicopter into position, feeling the G-forces pressing her into her seat. Lisa acquired targets through the targeting system, the crosshairs dancing across enemy positions hidden among the rocks. "Target acquired," Lisa announced. "Multiple fighters in the open. Request clearance to engage." Weapons free, Sarah confirmed, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. The first Hellfire missile streaked away from their helicopter with a brilliant flash. Sarah watched its contrail arc through the air before impacting directly on target. The explosion echoed across the valley as enemy fighters scrambled for cover. But something was wrong. The radio chatter from ground forces indicated they were taking heavy fire from unexpected directions. The enemy had more fighters than intelligence had suggested, and they were better positioned than anyone had anticipated. All Apache units, be advised. We have eyes on multiple enemy reinforcements moving into the area, came an urgent transmission from an observation post. Estimate 40 to 50 additional fighters approaching from the north. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What had started as a routine support mission was rapidly escalating into a major engagement. The friendly ground forces were now potentially outnumbered and outgunned. Major Thompson's voice crackled over the radio with new urgency. All units, we have a developing situation. Ground forces are reporting they're being surrounded. We need to provide immediate close air support to prevent them from being overrun. Sarah looked at the fuel gauge and ammunition counter. They had enough supplies for the original mission, but a prolonged engagement would push their limits. More concerning was the increasing amount of anti-aircraft fire rising from the ground. Enemy fighters had brought shoulder-fired missiles and heavy machine guns specifically designed to target helicopters. The other pilots began repositioning for continuous attack runs. Sarah could hear the tension in their voices as they coordinated targets and shared intelligence about enemy positions. This was no longer about proving women could fly combat missions. This was about saving the lives of soldiers on the ground who were counting on them. Rodriguez, how are we looking on targets? Sarah asked as she maneuvered the helicopter for another attack run. I've got multiple groups of fighters moving through the rocks. They're trying to flank our ground forces from 3 different directions. If we don't stop them now, our guys are going to be completely surrounded. Sarah took a deep breath and pushed the helicopter forward into the most dangerous airspace she had ever flown. Below them, hundreds of American soldiers were counting on her and her fellow pilots to keep them alive. The doubts and skepticism from training seemed insignificant compared to the responsibility she now carried. The real test was just beginning. The valley erupted into chaos as enemy reinforcements poured into the area from multiple directions. Sarah watched through her helmet display as dozens of heat signatures moved across the mountainous terrain. The friendly ground forces had advanced into what was rapidly becoming a trap. Captain Rodriguez worked frantically at her targeting systems, trying to identify and prioritize the most dangerous threats. Sarah, I'm tracking at least 30 fighters moving to cut off the retreat route. If they establish positions on that ridge, our ground forces will have nowhere to go. The Apache shuddered as machine gun rounds struck the armored hull. Warning lights flickered across the instrument panel, but all critical systems remained operational. Sarah had trained for this scenario hundreds of times, but the reality of being shot at sent ice through her veins. Major Thompson's helicopter swooped past them, firing rockets at enemy positions dug into the hillside. His voice came over the radio, strained with concentration. Apache 2, I need you to engage those fighters moving along the eastern slope. Apache 3 will cover the western approach. Sarah banked hard to the right, feeling the helicopter respond instantly to her commands. The Apache was built for this kind of close-quarters combat, but it required absolute precision from the pilot. One mistake could send them crashing into the rocky terrain below. Target acquired on the eastern slope, Rodriguez announced. I count 12 fighters with heavy weapons. They're setting up what looks like anti-aircraft positions. Take them out, Sarah ordered, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. The second Hellfire missile launched with a roar, streaking toward the enemy position. Sarah watched the impact through her display screen as the explosion scattered the enemy fighters, but more were already taking their place, emerging from caves and hidden positions throughout the mountains. Ground control came over the radio with urgent updates. All Apache units, ground forces are reporting heavy contact from multiple directions. Enemy forces have established blocking positions along the main escape route. Estimate 200 enemy fighters now engaged. 200 fighters. Sarah felt the magnitude of the situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. The intelligence estimates had been completely wrong. What was supposed to be a small group of enemy fighters had turned into a major enemy force, and they had walked directly into an ambush. Captain Johnson, piloting Apache 3, reported mechanical problems. Apache lead, I'm showing hydraulic pressure loss and engine temperature warnings.
I need to return to base immediately. That left only 2 helicopters to support hundreds of ground troops against overwhelming enemy forces.
Sarah could hear the strain in Major Thompson's voice as he processed the same information. Apache 2. We're on our own until reinforcements arrive. Ground forces have wounded and are running low on ammunition. We need to keep those escape routes open. Sarah pushed the helicopter forward, flying dangerously low between mountain peaks to avoid enemy fire. The terrain was treacherous, with sudden updrafts and downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into the rocks without warning. Every pilot had heard stories of helicopters that flew too low in mountainous terrain and never returned. Rodriguez continued engaging targets as fast as she could acquire them. I'm seeing muzzle flashes from that cave system to our north. Looks like they've got heavy machine guns positioned to cover the entire valley floor. The enemy had chosen their position well. The valley floor offered no cover for advancing troops, while the surrounding mountains provided perfect defensive positions for the fighters. American forces were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Sarah's training took over as she maneuvered the helicopter through increasingly heavy fire. She remembered her instructor's words about maintaining calm under pressure. Fear will get you killed faster than enemy bullets, he had said. Trust your training and trust your aircraft. The Apache's armor deflected small arms fire, but Sarah knew they were vulnerable to the shoulder-fired missiles and heavy machine guns the enemy was deploying. One lucky shot could bring them down, leaving the ground forces without air support. Apache lead, this is Bravo Company, came a desperate voice over the radio. We're taking heavy casualties and are nearly out of ammunition. Enemy forces have us surrounded on 3 sides. Request immediate close air support. Major Thompson's helicopter was already engaging targets on the western slope, his ammunition running low after continuous combat. Sarah could see tracer rounds streaming toward his aircraft as enemy fighters concentrated their fire on the helicopters. Apache 2. I need you to suppress those positions on the northern ridge, Thompson transmitted. Bravo Company is pinned down and can't move until we clear those machine gun nests. Sarah lined up for another attack run, flying directly into the teeth of enemy fire. Machine gun tracers streaked past the cockpit windows like deadly fireworks. The helicopter shook as rounds struck the fuselage, but the engines continued running smoothly. Rodriguez worked her targeting systems with practiced efficiency, despite the violent maneuvering required to avoid enemy fire. Multiple targets acquired. I've got at least 8 fighters in reinforced positions. They're well dug in. Light them up, Sarah commanded. The chain gun beneath the helicopter began firing, sending streams of 30mm rounds into the enemy positions. Sarah watched through her display as the high explosive rounds impacted among the rocks, sending fighters scrambling for deeper cover. But the enemy was learning to adapt. They had spread their forces across multiple positions, making it impossible for the helicopters to engage all threats simultaneously. As soon as one position was suppressed, fighters would emerge from other locations to continue their attack on the ground forces. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez monitored the radio frequencies from the ground, coordinating between the helicopters and various ground units. She had been skeptical about female pilots when the program first started, but watching Sarah and Rodriguez work under fire was changing her perspective. Apache 2. This is ground control, Vasquez transmitted. Be advised, we're tracking vehicle movement approaching from the south. Looks like technical vehicles with heavy weapons. ETA to your position approximately 10 minutes. Enemy reinforcements with vehicle-mounted weapons would dramatically shift the balance of the engagement. The helicopters were already outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Additional heavy weapons could make their position untenable. Sarah felt sweat running down her back despite the air conditioning in the cockpit. The stress of continuous combat was taking its toll, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate threats. Hundreds of soldiers were counting on her to keep fighting. Rodriguez, how are we looking on ammunition? Down to 60% on chain gun rounds, and we've got 4 Hellfire missiles remaining. If those vehicles show up with anti-aircraft weapons, we're going to be in serious trouble. The radio crackled with reports from ground units across the valley. Alpha Company was surrounded and requesting immediate evacuation. Bravo Company had taken multiple casualties and was running critically low on medical supplies. Charlie Company was attempting to establish a defensive perimeter, but was taking fire from elevated positions. Major Thompson's voice cut through the chatter. Apache 2. I'm showing multiple engine warnings and need to reduce power. You're going to have to carry most of the load until reinforcements arrive. Sarah's stomach dropped. If Thompson's helicopter was forced to withdraw, she would be the only air support for hundreds of surrounded soldiers. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but she knew there was no choice but to continue fighting. The enemy fighters seemed to sense the shifting dynamics of the battle. Their fire increased in intensity, with multiple positions engaging the helicopters simultaneously. Sarah could see muzzle flashes erupting from dozens of locations across the mountainous terrain. All ground units, this is Apache 2, Sarah transmitted, her voice carrying across the valley to the embattled soldiers below. We're not going anywhere. Help is on the way. But privately, she wondered if they could hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The distinctive sound of diesel engines echoed across the valley as enemy technical vehicles crested the southern ridge. Sarah's heart sank as she counted at least 6 pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns and what appeared to be anti-aircraft weapons. The enemy had been planning this ambush for weeks, possibly months. Apache lead, Apache 2, Sarah transmitted urgently. Confirmed enemy vehicles approaching from the south. I count multiple technical vehicles with heavy weapons. They're moving to establish positions overlooking the valley floor. Major Thompson's damaged helicopter was limping through the sky, black smoke trailing from one engine. His voice came back strained with pain and exhaustion. Copy Apache 2. My bird is barely staying airborne. You need to engage those vehicles before they get into position. Sarah pushed the Apache into a steep dive toward the approaching convoy. The technical vehicles were moving fast across the rough terrain, their drivers clearly experienced at navigating the mountainous landscape. Dust clouds marked their progress as they raced to establish firing positions. Rodriguez worked frantically to acquire targets through the helicopter's advanced targeting systems. I've got a clear shot at the lead vehicle, but they're moving too fast for a guaranteed hit with the Hellfire missiles. We'll have to get closer, Sarah decided, bringing the helicopter down to an altitude that would normally be considered suicidal in enemy territory. At this height, they were vulnerable to small arms fire from the ground, but it was the only way to ensure accurate targeting against the moving vehicles. The first technical vehicle reached a rocky outcrop and immediately began setting up its heavy machine gun. Sarah could see the weapon crew working to establish their firing position, which would give them clear fields of fire across the entire valley, where American troops were pinned down. Taking the shot, Rodriguez announced. The Hellfire missile streaked away from the Apache with a brilliant flash. Sarah held her breath as she watched the missile's contrail arc through the air. The technical vehicle tried to move at the last second, but the missile impacted directly on target. The explosion sent vehicle parts flying in all directions, as secondary explosions from ammunition stores lit up the mountainside. But 5 more vehicles continued their advance, and Sarah could see additional dust clouds in the distance indicating even more reinforcements approaching. The enemy had committed significant resources to this ambush, and they weren't giving up easily. Enemy fighters on the ground had learned to coordinate their fire more effectively. As Sarah maneuvered to engage the remaining vehicles, machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions simultaneously. The Apache shuddered under the impact of heavy rounds, and warning lights began illuminating across the instrument panel. Hydraulic system showing pressure loss, Rodriguez reported, her voice tight with concern. Primary flight controls are still responding, but we're going to have reduced maneuverability. Sarah felt the helicopter's response change subtly as hydraulic pressure dropped. The controls required more force to operate, and the aircraft's movements became less precise. In air-to-air combat, such damage could be manageable, but flying close air support missions in mountainous terrain required peak aircraft performance. The second technical vehicle had reached its position and opened fire with a heavy machine gun that sent streams of tracer rounds toward the helicopter. Sarah banked hard to avoid the fire, feeling the damaged hydraulics strain against the sudden maneuver. Below them, the situation for ground forces was becoming desperate. Alpha Company had been completely cut off from the rest of the force and was surrounded on all sides. Their radio transmissions painted a grim picture of wounded soldiers and critically low ammunition supplies. Apache 2, this is Alpha 6, came the company commander's voice over the radio. We've got 12 wounded and are down to our last magazines. Enemy forces are preparing for what looks like a final assault on our position. We need immediate support. Sarah looked at her ammunition counter. 3 Hellfire missiles and 40% remaining on the chain gun. Not nearly enough to deal with all the threats facing the ground forces, but she had to try. The remaining technical vehicles had reached their positions and were beginning to establish overlapping fields of fire across the valley. Their heavy machine guns could reach targets that small arms fire couldn't touch, effectively eliminating any safe movement for the American forces. Major Thompson's voice crackled over the radio, weaker than before. "Apache 2, I'm declaring an emergency. Both engines are showing critical temperature warnings, and I'm losing altitude. I have to return to base immediately or risk total engine failure." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle fully on her shoulders. Hundreds of soldiers were about to be left with a single damaged helicopter as their only air support against overwhelming enemy forces. The odds were impossible, but there was no choice but to continue fighting. "Understood, Apache lead. We'll hold the line until reinforcements arrive." Rodriguez was already acquiring the next target, her hands steady despite the increasingly desperate situation. "Second technical vehicle acquired. They're setting up what looks like an anti-aircraft gun." The enemy had brought sophisticated weapons to this engagement. Anti-aircraft guns could engage helicopters at much greater ranges than small arms fire, effectively denying the Apache the ability to provide close support to ground forces. Sarah lined up for another attack run, flying directly toward the technical vehicles despite the increasing volume of fire directed at her helicopter. Machine gun rounds hammered against the Apache's armored hull, and she could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the cockpit. "Missile away," Rodriguez announced. The second Hellfire missile impacted the technical vehicle just as its crew was preparing to fire. The explosion echoed across the valley, but Sarah knew it was too little, too late. 3 more vehicles remained operational, and enemy fighters were closing in on the surrounded ground forces from multiple directions. Staff Sergeant Vasquez coordinated desperately from the command post, trying to direct the limited air support to where it was most needed. She had watched the female pilots prove themselves under fire, but the situation was rapidly becoming impossible for any pilot regardless of gender. "All units, be advised, we have additional enemy forces approaching from the east," Vasquez transmitted. "Intelligence estimates at least 100 additional fighters moving to reinforce current positions." The enemy had planned this ambush carefully, drawing American forces into a carefully prepared killing zone. They had more fighters, better positions, and now vehicle-mounted heavy weapons that could engage the helicopters at longer ranges. Sarah's fuel gauge showed 30 minutes of flight time remaining at current consumption rates. Combat maneuvering used fuel much faster than normal flight, and she was already below the level that would normally require an immediate return to base. But the ground forces had no other support. Navy fighters were too far away to provide immediate assistance, and artillery couldn't reach the valley due to the mountainous terrain. The Apache helicopter was the only thing standing between hundreds of American soldiers and complete disaster. "Rodriguez, how many targets can you identify from this position?" "I'm seeing at least 20 enemy positions with active muzzle flashes. The remaining technical vehicles are setting up to provide supporting fire for what looks like a coordinated ground assault." Sarah could see enemy fighters moving through the rocks toward the isolated positions held by American forces. They were advancing under cover of heavy weapons fire, using professional military tactics that suggested these weren't just random fighters, but trained soldiers. The radio erupted with desperate calls for support from multiple ground units. Charlie Company was taking casualties from mortar fire. Bravo Company was requesting immediate medical evacuation for critically wounded soldiers. Alpha Company had gone silent after reporting they were being overrun. Sarah made her decision. Fuel state and ammunition levels didn't matter anymore. She was going to stay and fight until either reinforcements arrived or her helicopter was shot down. The soldiers on the ground deserved nothing less than everything she could give them. Rodriguez prepped the remaining missiles. "We're going to make our last shots count." The final phase of the battle was about to begin. The silence from Alpha Company's radio sent a chill through Sarah's spine. She could see their position through the helicopter's thermal imaging system, and the situation looked catastrophic. Enemy fighters had overrun the outer perimeter and were advancing toward the center of the defensive position where wounded soldiers had taken shelter. "Rodriguez, I need you to put everything we have into that position. Alpha Company is about to be completely overrun." Captain Rodriguez's hands flew across her targeting controls, designating multiple enemy positions around the embattled American forces. The thermal imaging showed dozens of enemy fighters moving through the rocks, using coordinated fire and movement tactics that demonstrated sophisticated military training. Sarah pushed the Apache into a diving attack run that brought them dangerously close to the mountain peaks. At this altitude, they were vulnerable to every weapon the enemy possessed, but it was the only way to provide accurate fire support to the surrounded soldiers. The chain gun beneath the helicopter roared to life, sending streams of 30 Miller high-explosive rounds into the enemy positions. Sarah watched through her helmet display as the rounds impacted among the rocks, forcing enemy fighters to seek cover and disrupting their assault on Alpha Company. But the respite was temporary. As soon as the helicopter moved to engage other targets, the enemy fighters emerged from cover and continued their advance. They had learned that the single remaining Apache couldn't be everywhere at once. "Apache 2, this is Alpha 6, came a weak voice over the radio. "Thanks for the support. We've got wounded who need immediate medical evacuation, but enemy forces control all the landing zones." Medical evacuation helicopters couldn't land in areas under direct enemy fire. The wounded soldiers would have to wait until the area was secured, but Sarah was running out of ammunition and fuel to make that happen. The remaining technical vehicles had established their positions and were now providing supporting fire for the enemy ground assault. Heavy machine gun rounds streaked across the valley, forcing American troops to keep their heads down and making coordinated defense almost impossible. Sarah lined up for another attack run against the technical vehicles, knowing this would likely be her last chance to eliminate them before running out of Hellfire missiles. The enemy crews had learned to track the helicopter's movements and were ready with concentrated fire. "Third technical acquired," Rodriguez announced. "But they've got multiple heavy weapons trained on our approach vector." "Take the shot," Sarah ordered, pushing the helicopter forward, despite the wall of tracer fire rising to meet them. The Hellfire missile launched just as machine gun rounds began impacting the Apache's armored hull. Sarah felt the helicopter shudder under the punishment, and several warning lights illuminated on the instrument panel. The missile streaked toward its target through the enemy fire. The explosion destroyed the technical vehicle and its crew, but not before they had inflicted significant damage on the Apache. Sarah could feel the helicopter's flight characteristics changing as damaged systems struggled to maintain normal operation. "We've lost partial power in the tail rotor," Rodriguez reported, studying the warning displays. "Flight controls are becoming increasingly difficult to manage." Tail rotor damage was serious. Without full control of the tail rotor, the helicopter would become difficult to maneuver and eventually impossible to fly. Sarah had perhaps 15 minutes before the damage would force them to land, whether they wanted to or not. But 15 minutes might be enough to make a difference for the soldiers fighting for their lives below. The enemy had committed everything to this assault. Sarah could see fighters emerging from hidden positions throughout the mountains, converging on the American positions like wolves closing in for the kill. Intelligence estimates had been catastrophically wrong about enemy strength in the area. Bravo Company was holding a ridgeline position, but taking casualties from accurate sniper fire. Their company commander reported that they were down to 30% of their original strength and running critically low on ammunition. "Apache 2, this is Bravo 6, came the transmission. "We've identified the sniper positions, but they're in reinforced caves we can't reach with small arms."
"Can you engage those positions?"
Sarah looked at her remaining ammunition. 1 Hellfire missile and 20% chain gun rounds. Not nearly enough to deal with all the threats facing the ground forces. But she had to prioritize the most dangerous targets. The sniper positions were carved into the mountainside, providing excellent protection from small arms fire, while offering clear fields of fire across the valley. Eliminating them would allow Bravo Company to move and provide better support to the other units. Rodriguez acquired the targets through the helicopter's advanced targeting systems. "I've got visual on 3 separate cave positions with active muzzle flashes. Range 800 meters. Sarah maneuvered the damaged helicopter into position for the final Hellfire missile shot. The tail rotor damage made precise flying increasingly difficult, and she had to constantly adjust the controls to maintain heading and altitude. Enemy fighters had learned to recognize the helicopter's attack patterns and were ready with concentrated fire. As Sarah lined up for the attack run, machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions. The Apache shook under the impact of heavy rounds striking the fuselage. "Last missile away," Rodriguez announced. The Hellfire missile streaked toward the cave positions with perfect accuracy. The explosion sealed the main cave entrance and eliminated the sniper threat to Bravo Company. But Sarah knew it wasn't enough to change the overall situation. Charlie Company was reporting that enemy forces were massing for what appeared to be a final coordinated assault. They had identified at least 60 fighters moving into position for a simultaneous attack from 3 directions. Staff Sergeant Vasquez worked frantically at the command post, trying to coordinate the defense with limited resources. She had called for emergency reinforcements, but the nearest friendly units were hours away. Artillery support wasn't available due to the mountainous terrain, and close air support was limited to Sarah's damaged helicopter. "All units be advised, we have confirmed enemy forces preparing for coordinated assault," Vasquez transmitted. "Estimate 60 to 80 fighters moving into final positions. All units prepare for sustained contact." Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and ammunition counter. 10 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption, and only the chain gun rounds left for weapons. The helicopter's damaged systems were making flight increasingly difficult, and she knew they would soon be forced to land. But she also knew that those 10 minutes might mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of American soldiers. "Rodriguez, identify the most critical targets. We're going to make every round count." The enemy assault began with a coordinated barrage of mortar and rocket-propelled grenade fire that erupted across the American positions. Enemy fighters advanced under cover of the barrage, using fire and movement tactics that demonstrated professional military training. Sarah pushed the damaged Apache forward into the most intensive combat flying of her career. The helicopter responded sluggishly to her controls, damaged systems forcing her to compensate constantly for the aircraft's changing flight characteristics. The chain gun engaged target after target as Rodriguez worked to disrupt the enemy assault. Streams of 30mm rounds impacted among the advancing fighters, forcing them to seek cover and slowing their advance toward the American positions. But there were too many targets and too little ammunition. For every enemy fighter they eliminated, 2 more emerged from hidden positions to continue the assault. The situation was becoming impossible to sustain. Major Williams, the ground force commander, made the difficult decision that would determine the fate of everyone in the valley. His voice came over the radio with grim determination. "All units prepare for emergency extraction. Apache 2, we need you to cover the landing zones for medical evacuation helicopters." Medical evacuation helicopters were en route, but they couldn't land in areas under direct enemy fire. Sarah would have to use her remaining ammunition to suppress enemy fire long enough for the evacuation to take place. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was the only option left for saving the wounded soldiers trapped in the valley. The distinctive sound of medical evacuation helicopters echoed across the valley as 2 Black Hawks approached from the east. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror as she realized the magnitude of what was about to happen. She had to keep the landing zones clear of enemy fire long enough for the evacuation helicopters to land. "Load wounded soldiers and escape. Medevac 1. This is Apache 2, Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the impossible odds. "Be advised, landing zones are under direct enemy fire. I'll provide suppression, but you'll have to move fast." The first Black Hawk pilot's response carried the tension of flying into a combat zone. "Copy, Apache 2. We've got critical patients that can't wait. Just give us 30 seconds on the ground." 30 seconds might not sound like much time, but in combat it felt like an eternity. Sarah would have to suppress enemy fire from multiple positions simultaneously while managing her damaged helicopter's deteriorating flight characteristics. Rodriguez had identified the most dangerous threats to the landing zones. "I count at least 12 positions with direct fire capabilities on the primary landing zone. The remaining technical vehicles have moved to positions where they can engage the medevac helicopters during landing." Sarah's ammunition counter showed less than 10% remaining on the chain gun, not nearly enough to suppress all the identified threats. But she would have to make every round count. The first medical evacuation helicopter began its approach to Alpha Company's position, where the most critically wounded soldiers were located. Enemy fighters immediately recognized the threat and began concentrating their fire on the incoming aircraft. Sarah pushed her damaged Apache into the most dangerous flying of her career, positioning herself directly between the medical helicopter and the enemy technical vehicles. The tail rotor damage made precise maneuvering nearly impossible, but she forced the aircraft to respond through sheer determination. The chain gun fired its remaining rounds in controlled bursts, targeting the technical vehicles that posed the greatest threat to the medical evacuation. Sarah watched her ammunition counter drop to 0 as the last high-explosive rounds impacted near the enemy positions. Winchester on all weapons, Rodriguez reported, using the military term for being out of ammunition. The second Black Hawk touched down heavily, its pilot struggling to control the aircraft after taking multiple hits during the approach. Medical personnel rushed to load wounded soldiers, while enemy fire continued to impact around the landing zone. Without ammunition, Sarah could only use her helicopter's presence to distract enemy fighters and draw their fire away from the medical evacuation. She flew aggressive maneuvers that brought her aircraft dangerously close to enemy positions, hoping to force them to target the Apache instead of the defenseless medical helicopter. Enemy fighters took the bait, concentrating their fire on Sarah's helicopter. Machine gun rounds hammered against the Apache's armor, and she could hear the distinctive sound of bullets passing close to the cockpit. Warning alarms filled the cabin as critical systems began failing throughout the aircraft. Hydraulic system failure, Rodriguez announced, her voice tight with concern. Primary flight controls are no longer responding normally. The Apache was dying around them, but the medical helicopter was still on the ground loading wounded soldiers. Sarah fought to maintain control as the helicopter's flight characteristics changed dramatically with the loss of hydraulic power. Staff Sergeant Martinez, one of the wounded soldiers being loaded onto the medical helicopter, looked up at the Apache hovering overhead. He had been skeptical about female pilots when the program started, but watching Captain Mitchell risk everything to protect the evacuation was changing his perspective completely. Medevac 2, how much longer? Sarah transmitted, her voice strained as she wrestled with the damaged controls. 60 seconds, came the reply. We've got critically wounded soldiers that require careful loading. 60 more seconds of flying a helicopter that was rapidly becoming unflyable. Sarah could feel the aircraft wanting to spin out of control as the damaged tail rotor struggled to maintain directional stability. Enemy fighters were closing in on the landing zone, advancing under cover of supporting fire from positions throughout the mountains. They could see that the Apache was no longer firing, and were taking advantage of the opportunity to overwhelm the medical evacuation. Major Chen, commanding the ground security around the landing zone, made a desperate decision. All units establish defensive perimeter around the landing zone, fix bayonets, and prepare for close combat. American soldiers formed a defensive circle around the medical helicopter, preparing to fight with whatever ammunition they had left. The situation had deteriorated to the point where infantry soldiers were preparing for hand-to-hand combat to protect wounded comrades. Sarah's fuel gauge showed 2 minutes of flight time remaining. Even if she could keep the helicopter airborne, they would soon be forced to auto-rotate to the ground in the middle of enemy territory. Rodriguez, prepare for emergency landing. We're not going to make it back to base. The second medical helicopter finally lifted off, carrying another load of critically wounded soldiers to safety. Sarah watched it climb away from the valley, knowing that her sacrifice had helped save those lives. But her own situation was becoming desperate. The Apache was losing altitude as engine power decreased with critically low fuel levels. She had to find a place to land before the helicopter crashed uncontrollably into the mountainous terrain. Enemy fighters were advancing toward her anticipated landing zone, recognizing that they were about to capture or kill the female pilot, who had been disrupting their assault all morning. Apache 2, this is ground control, came Staff Sergeant Vasquez's voice over the radio. Fast movers are inbound to your position. ETA 5 minutes. Fighter jets were finally approaching to provide close air support, but Sarah's helicopter would be on the ground long before they arrived. She would have to survive in enemy territory until help could reach her. The Apache's engines began winding down as fuel starvation affected power output. Sarah looked for the best available landing site, knowing that wherever she touched down would likely become a battleground. Rodriguez, check your survival gear. We're going down in enemy territory. The helicopter settled toward the rocky ground as Sarah performed an emergency auto-rotation landing. The Apache touched down hard, sending shocks through the airframe as the landing gear absorbed the impact. Enemy fighters were already moving toward their position, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes as they began firing at the grounded helicopter. She and Rodriguez would have to defend themselves with personal weapons until friendly forces could reach them. The most dangerous part of their mission was just beginning, her damaged Apache between the medevac helicopter and the enemy positions, using her aircraft as a shield while engaging targets with the chain gun. Machine gun rounds hammered against the Apache's armored hull as she maneuvered to protect the vulnerable evacuation aircraft. The Black Hawk touched down in a cloud of dust and debris as medical personnel rushed to load wounded soldiers. Sarah could see enemy fighters moving to better positions to engage the helicopter, and she knew she had to act fast. The chain gun engaged multiple targets in rapid succession, forcing enemy fighters to seek cover, just as they were preparing to fire rocket-propelled grenades at the medical helicopter. The high-explosive rounds impacted among the rocks, sending fragments flying in all directions. 30 seconds, the medevac pilot transmitted tersely. Sarah's helicopter shuddered as the damaged tail rotor struggled to maintain control. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel, and she could feel the aircraft becoming increasingly difficult to fly. Every maneuver required maximum concentration to prevent the helicopter from spinning out of control. Enemy fighters had learned to coordinate their attacks, waiting for the Apache to engage one position before emerging from others to fire at the medical helicopters. They understood that the single attack helicopter couldn't suppress all threats simultaneously. Time to go, the first medevac pilot announced, lifting off with a full load of wounded soldiers. Sarah watched the Black Hawk climb away from the valley, carrying critically injured American soldiers to safety. But the second medical helicopter was already beginning its approach to Bravo Company's position, and the enemy was ready for it. The remaining technical vehicles had repositioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across the landing zone. Their heavy machine guns could reach targets that small arms couldn't touch, making them the most dangerous threat to the incoming medical helicopter. Rodriguez, I need you to designate those technical vehicles. We have to take them out before Medevac 2 reaches the landing zone. But Rodriguez's targeting system was showing multiple warnings as battle damage accumulated throughout the helicopter systems. Targeting computer is intermittent. I'm having trouble maintaining lock on moving targets. Sarah was running out of options. The Apache systems were failing. Ammunition was critically low and fuel would only last a few more minutes. But wounded soldiers were depending on the second medical evacuation, and she couldn't abandon them. The second Black Hawk began its approach under intense enemy fire. Tracer rounds streaked across the valley as enemy fighters concentrated everything they had on the vulnerable aircraft. Sarah could see the helicopter taking hits as it descended toward the landing zone. Medevac 2 is taking fire, came an urgent transmission from the command post. Multiple hits reported. Sarah Push Women Warriors, 6th document. The Apache helicopter settled into the rocky terrain with a grinding crash that sent sparks flying from the damaged landing gear. Sarah quickly shut down the remaining systems to prevent fire while Rodriguez grabbed the survival radio and emergency medical kit from the rear compartment. Enemy fighters were already moving toward their position from multiple directions, using the rocky terrain for cover as they advanced. Sarah could see at least 20 fighters closing in on the downed helicopter, their weapons ready for what they expected to be an easy capture. Rodriguez, how's your ammunition situation? Sarah asked, checking her own survival vest for spare magazines. 4 magazines for the carbine plus my sidearm. Not much for a sustained firefight, Rodriguez replied, her voice steady despite their desperate situation. The two women took defensive positions using the helicopter's armored hull for cover. The Apache's thick armor plating could stop small arms fire, but they were surrounded and outnumbered by at least 10 to 1. Sarah activated the survival radio and transmitted their position to the command post. Ground control, this is Apache 2. We are down in enemy territory approximately 2 kilometers north of Alpha Company's position. Request immediate search and rescue. Staff Sergeant Vasquez's voice came back immediately. Apache 2, search and rescue is being organized, but all available aircraft are committed to medical evacuation missions. You need to hold your position until we can get to you. The first enemy fighters reached positions within rifle range and opened fire on the downed helicopter. Bullets sparked off the Apache's armor while Sarah and Rodriguez returned. Fire with their personal weapons. Sarah's first shots dropped 2 enemy fighters who had exposed themselves while advancing across open ground. Her marksmanship training was paying off as she engaged targets at ranges that pushed the limits of her carbine's effectiveness. Rodriguez was proving equally effective with her weapon, methodically engaging enemy fighters as they attempted to close the distance to the helicopter. Her calm precision under fire demonstrated the same skills that had made her an outstanding aerial gunner. But ammunition was limited, and the enemy had numbers on their side. They were advancing by fire and movement, with some fighters providing covering fire while others moved to better positions. Major Hassan, the enemy force commander, had been surprised by the effectiveness of the female pilots throughout the morning's engagement. He had expected American women to break under the pressure of combat, but these two had fought as effectively as any male pilots he had encountered. "Concentrate fire on the helicopter," Hassan ordered his fighters. "These pilots have cost us too many casualties. I want them captured alive for intelligence purposes." The enemy fire intensified as more fighters reached effective range. Sarah could hear bullets impacting all around their position, sending rock fragments flying through the air. The Apache's armor was holding, but they were running low on ammunition. The distinctive sound of jet engines echoed across the valley as Air Force F-16 fighters finally arrived on station. Sarah felt a surge of hope as she heard the lead pilot's transmission over the radio. "Apache 2, this is Viper 1. We have eyes on your position and multiple enemy forces converging on your location. Can you mark your position with smoke?" Sarah threw a smoke grenade that billowed green smoke to mark their location for the incoming fighters. "Viper 1, that's green smoke at our position. Enemy forces are advancing from the north, east, and west. Approximately 50 fighters in the immediate area." The first F-16 screamed overhead at low altitude, its cannon firing at enemy positions visible from the air. The 20mm rounds impacted among the rocks, forcing enemy fighters to seek cover and disrupting their coordinated assault on the downed helicopter. But the fighters couldn't stay on station indefinitely, and they couldn't engage targets too close to Sarah and Rodriguez's position without risking friendly fire. The enemy fighters learned quickly to stay close to the helicopter, using the American pilots as human shields. Sergeant First Class Johnson was monitoring the situation from the Tactical Operations Center, coordinating multiple rescue efforts across the valley. The female pilots had proven themselves under impossible conditions, but their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. "All available units, we have American aircrew down in enemy territory. Priority mission is search and rescue for Apache 2 crew," Johnson transmitted to units across the area. "Charlie Company." The closest friendly ground force was still 3 kilometers away and engaged with enemy forces blocking their advance. They were fighting to reach the downed helicopter, but enemy resistance was fierce and well coordinated. Sarah's ammunition was running critically low. She had fired 3 of her 4 magazines and was down to her last 30 rounds. Rodriguez was in similar condition, carefully selecting targets to make every shot count. The enemy fighters were learning to use the terrain effectively, advancing through draws and behind rock formations that provided concealment from both the downed pilots and the circling fighters above. "Rodriguez, we need to move to a better position," Sarah decided, looking at the rocky ridge behind their current location. "This position is going to be overrun in the next few minutes. Moving would expose them to enemy fire, but staying in place meant certain capture or death as enemy forces closed in from all sides. The ridge offered better defensive positions but would require a dangerous sprint across open ground. "On 3, Sarah said, preparing to move. 1, 2, 3. Both women sprinted toward the ridge as enemy fire erupted around them. Bullets cracked through the air as they ran across the rocky terrain, using their remaining ammunition to suppress enemy fighters who tried to engage them during the movement. Rodriguez stumbled as a bullet grazed her leg, but she continued moving toward the ridge. Sarah provided covering fire as her partner reached the defensive position, then followed under intense enemy fire. The new position offered better fields of fire and more protection from advancing enemy forces, but they were still surrounded and running out of ammunition. Sarah checked her weapon and found she had less than 1 magazine remaining. The F-16 fighters continued their attacks on enemy positions, but they were running low on ammunition as well. The lead pilot reported that they would have to return to base for refueling and rearming within the next 10 minutes. "Apache 2, this is Viper 1. We're Winchester on ammunition and need to RTB for gas. Additional air support is en route, but you're going to have a gap in coverage." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized they would soon lose their air support. Without the fighters keeping enemy forces at bay, the situation would become impossible to sustain. Captain Torres, leading the search and rescue effort, was pushing his team to their limits trying to reach the downed aircrew. His soldiers had been fighting continuously for hours, but they pressed forward through enemy territory toward the helicopter crash site. Alpha Team, this is Rescue 6. Apache 2 crew is still alive and fighting, but their situation is critical. We need to reach them in the next 30 minutes or we're going to lose them. The enemy fighters were regrouping for what appeared to be a final assault on the ridge position. Sarah could see them moving through the rocks, coordinating their approach for a simultaneous attack from multiple directions. She and Rodriguez prepared for what might be their last stand, checking their weapons and preparing their final magazines. They had saved hundreds of American lives during the morning's engagement, but their own survival was now in serious doubt. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed across the valley as search and rescue aircraft finally approached their position. But enemy fighters were also preparing for their final assault, and the race to reach the downed pilots had become a matter of minutes. The rescue helicopters appeared over the eastern ridge, just as enemy fighters began their final assault on Sarah and Rodriguez's position. Two Blackhawks escorted by Apache gunships swept into the valley with their guns blazing, engaging enemy positions that had been marked by the circling F-16 fighters. Sarah felt a surge of hope as she watched the Apache gunships systematically destroy enemy positions with Hellfire missiles and chain gun fire. The rescue aircraft had arrived with overwhelming firepower, turning the tables on the enemy forces that had been closing in for the kill. Apache 2, this is Rescue 1, came the transmission from the lead Blackhawk. We're coming to get you. Pop smoke to mark your position and keep your heads down. Sarah threw her last smoke grenade, sending purple smoke billowing across the ridge to mark their location for the rescue helicopters. Enemy fighters continued firing at their position, but the concentrated air support was forcing them to keep their heads down. The first Apache gunship made a devastating attack run against enemy positions on the northern slope. Hellfire missiles impacted among the rocks where enemy fighters had been preparing to assault the ridge, sending massive explosions echoing across the valley. Rodriguez was limping from her leg wound but still firing at enemy targets as they tried to reposition. Her ammunition was down to her last magazine, but she continued engaging threats with the same precision she had demonstrated throughout the morning's combat. 30 seconds to pick up, the rescue pilot announced over the radio. Enemy fighters made a desperate attempt to reach the ridge before the rescue could be completed. Sarah watched dozens of fighters emerge from cover simultaneously, advancing toward their position with total disregard for the air support overhead. The Apache gunships responded immediately, their chain guns sending streams of 30mm rounds into the advancing enemy forces. The high explosive rounds impacted among the fighters, forcing them to seek cover and disrupting their final assault. But some enemy fighters continued advancing, determined to prevent the rescue of the American pilots. Sarah and Rodriguez used their remaining ammunition to engage the closest threats. Knowing that every second counted, the rescue Blackhawk touched down on the ridge in a cloud of dust and debris, its crew chief already moving to assist the wounded aircrew. Sarah helped Rodriguez toward the helicopter while continuing to watch for enemy fighters who might still pose a threat. "Move, move, move," shouted the crew chief as he helped Rodriguez into the helicopter. Sarah took one last look at her downed Apache helicopter, feeling a mixture of sadness and pride. The aircraft had taken tremendous damage, but had continued flying long enough to save countless lives. She climbed into the rescue helicopter as the pilot prepared for immediate takeoff. The Blackhawk lifted off under covering fire from the Apache gunships, climbing rapidly away from the valley where they had fought for their lives. Sarah watched the landscape fall away below them, seeing the positions where American ground forces had been surrounded and nearly overrun. Colonel Barnes, the mission commander who had been skeptical about female pilots, was waiting at the forward operating base when the rescue helicopter landed. He had monitored the entire engagement from the command post and had seen firsthand what the women pilots had accomplished under impossible conditions. "Captain Mitchell, Captain Rodriguez," he said as they climbed out of the helicopter. "Outstanding job out there. You saved a lot of lives today." The medical team immediately began treating Rodriguez's leg wound while Sarah underwent standard post-combat debriefing procedures. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, and she was beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what they had experienced. Staff Sergeant Vasquez approached Sarah with preliminary casualty reports from the morning's engagement. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know the final numbers. We evacuated 43 wounded soldiers, and intelligence estimates we eliminated over 100 enemy fighters. Without your air support, we would have lost entire companies. The numbers were sobering. 43 American soldiers had been wounded in the engagement, but none had been killed thanks to the air support provided by the Apache helicopters. The medical evacuations had been successful, and all wounded soldiers were receiving treatment at advanced medical facilities. Major Thompson, who had been forced to return to base with his damaged helicopter, met Sarah at the debriefing room. His aircraft had suffered engine damage but had been successfully repaired by maintenance crews. "Mitchell, I owe you an apology," Thompson said, his expression serious. "I had my doubts about women in combat aviation, but what you did out there today was extraordinary. You and Rodriguez proved yourselves under the worst possible conditions." The debriefing session lasted several hours as intelligence officers tried to understand how the enemy had managed to establish such a large force in the area without detection. The ambush had been carefully planned and executed, demonstrating sophisticated military capabilities that had surprised everyone involved. Captain Sarah Mitchell found herself becoming something of a celebrity within the military community. News of the female pilot's performance under combat conditions spread quickly through military channels, and their actions were being studied as examples of effective close air support operations. But Sarah was more interested in the broader implications of what had happened. The engagement had definitively proven that women could perform effectively in combat aviation roles, even under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Several weeks later, Sarah received orders to report to the Pentagon for meetings with senior military leadership. The success of female pilots in combat operations was being used to justify expanding opportunities for women throughout the military. General Patricia Hayes, the first female pilot to achieve general officer rank, met with Sarah during her Pentagon visit. "Captain Mitchell, your actions have changed the conversation about women in combat. The skeptics can no longer argue that women lack the physical strength or emotional stability for combat aviation. The policy implications were significant. Sarah's combat performance, along with that of other female pilots, was being used to support arguments for opening additional combat roles to women throughout the military services. Captain Rodriguez made a full recovery from her leg wound and returned to flight status within 2 months. She and Sarah were both awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for their actions during the engagement, making them among the first women to receive the Decoration for Combat Aviation. The enemy force that had ambushed the American troops was later identified as a specially trained unit that had been preparing the operation for months. Intelligence analysis revealed that they had expected to inflict catastrophic casualties on American forces and had been surprised by the effectiveness of the air support provided by the Apache helicopters. Colonel Barnes, who had initially questioned the assignment of female crews to combat missions, became one of the strongest advocates for women in combat aviation. His reports to higher headquarters emphasized the professional competence and courage demonstrated by the female pilots under extreme conditions. The valley where the engagement took place was later secured by additional American forces, who discovered extensive enemy preparations including weapons caches, communications equipment, and detailed intelligence about American operations in the area. Sarah continued her military career, eventually becoming an instructor pilot responsible for training the next generation of Apache crews. Her combat experience made her uniquely qualified to teach both male and female pilots the skills needed for effective combat operations. The engagement became a case study taught at military academies and staff colleges, demonstrating the importance of close air support in protecting ground forces and the capabilities of modern attack helicopters in combat operations. Years later, when critics still questioned whether women belonged in combat roles, military leaders would point to the actions of Captain Sarah Mitchell and Captain Lisa Rodriguez as definitive proof that gender was irrelevant when it came to courage, skill, and effectiveness under fire. The doubters had been proven wrong in the most convincing way possible. When hundreds of American soldiers were surrounded and facing annihilation, 2 women pilots had risked everything to keep them alive. Their actions had spoken louder than any argument about the role of women in combat aviation. The legacy of their heroism would inspire generations of female military aviators who followed in their footsteps, knowing that the barriers had been broken and the path forward had been cleared by those who came before them.